This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. So I made a video not too long ago that is essentially just a list of facts about racial bias in policing and criminal justice. You should probably watch that video before this one. My hope was to make the simple point that the evidence of racism and implicit bias in law enforcement not only existed, but was kind of overwhelming. That video was not intended to be the final word on the subject, just something to get the gears moving, get a conversation started, and encourage people to dig a little deeper on their own. That's sort of the point of most of my videos. And I expected some pushback to this, obviously. A lot of people will often blame the increased attention that Black people receive from the police on various things. Black people commit more crime. Black people are more likely to resist. Black communities embrace a culture of criminality and violence. Of course, these claims ignore much of the data that I presented in that video. Studies show that Black people are stopped, arrested, and attacked more than white people, even when accounting for factors such as crime rate or the actual threat posed by something such as the existence of a weapon. Also, people sometimes respond to these claims by changing the subject or straw-manning the argument. You know, stuff like, what about Black-on-Black crime? Or what about the supposed violence of Antifa or Black Lives Matter? So sometimes it's hard to have this conversation when people are not listening to the actual arguments being made. There is one argument that I didn't necessarily anticipate, even though I still would say that many of my sources provide counterclaims. But to be fair, I didn't specifically address it in that video. And interestingly, this is an argument that comes from both the left and the right side of the political spectrum. Hi, I'm T1J.
Follow me.
This video, like all my videos, would not be possible without my members and patrons, including homies like Farrelloides, Kirk, Jonathan R, and M Crimson Kitty. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a homie yourself by clicking the join button below the video or by checking out my page on Patreon. So I did mention in that aforementioned video that a large part of the reason for the prevalence of crime within the Black community is poverty. Poverty, as we should all be able to acknowledge, is strongly linked with crime, especially violent crime. And Black Americans are disproportionately poor, due mostly to centuries of systemic oppression and discrimination. However, some of the people who understand this have suggested that perhaps poverty is not a factor, but the factor. And this argument generally occurs in one of two ways. Firstly, perhaps the police and the criminal justice system don't specifically have a bias against Black people or other people of color. Maybe there's just a bias against poor people. And since Black people are disproportionately poor, this bias affects them disproportionately. So it's not really racism or anti-Blackness that we have to focus on. It's the disdain for and mistrust of the poor that we have to tackle. The second way this argument is put forth is the suggestion that there is no specific bias against Black people, the poor, or whatever. It is simply the mere existence of poverty that leads to increased crime and thus increased interactions with the police. Now, depending on who you are, you might argue that poor people should be taking more responsibility for their actions and working harder to get out of their situations, which would supposedly result in less harassment from the police. Or you might argue that poor people are marginalized and oppressed. And instead of interacting with the government in a way that enriches or improves their quality of life, all of their interactions with the government are unpleasant, if not violent. So again, the solution is not to focus on racial sensitivity or race relations, but instead to eliminate the state of poverty. And depending how left you are, also the police and possibly also the government altogether. And also there are other versions of this argument, such as the idea that power imbalances, such as that between the police and civilians or the rich and the poor, enable racism. And getting rid of those imbalances will essentially nullify the effects of racism. Anyone who knows anything about my worldview knows that poverty is my #1 political concern. I made a whole video about it. And personally, I think it's quite clear that there is an air of disdain for the poor in the United States. We tend to think about wealth as a reward for smart, hardworking people. And we have this mentality that if you can't pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, then that's just your fault. No one forces you to do drugs or commit crimes. That's just a sign that you're a weak person. And there's no reason to believe that this bias against the poor doesn't also exist in law enforcement. So I don't mean to be reductive. Obviously, there are enough people in the world so that we can tackle more than one issue at the same time. Some people might focus on poverty while others focus on race issues. But this idea that all of this violence, harassment, and incarceration that happens disproportionately to Black Americans can be explained totally or even mostly through a lens of poverty is tenuous at best. And my bad for not making that clear in the last video, I guess, but I'll try better this time. Now, class is obviously a factor in most social justice conversations, but ignoring or sidestepping the very real effect that racism, both individual and systemic, and implicit bias has on people of color in America, or assuming that solving poverty somehow precludes racial oppression or racial bias in any context, much less criminal justice, is really counterproductive in my opinion. So firstly, as we've covered many times, poverty is often cited as a major predictor of crime. Most people can agree that it's true that poor people both commit and are the victims of a disproportionate amount of violent crime. And in fact, the rates of violence are pretty consistent between poor whites and poor blacks, which, by the way, disputes this narrative you often hear about a supposed culture of violence unique to the Black community. However, if poverty and not race both predicts the prevalence of violent crime and the prevalence of police brutality and bias, you shouldn't expect to see a significant discrepancy among the races when it comes to policing while controlling for the rate of violent crime. However, as I hopefully explained in that other video and the long list of sources accompanying it, that isn't what happens. Several studies show that there is still racial disparity in the criminal justice system even after you factor in the differences in crime rate. One common assertion was that comparing Black people to white people without controlling for income levels was not a fair way to do this kind of analysis. But since we can often draw a fairly straight line from the rate of poverty to the rate of violent crime, controlling for violent crime potentially achieves the same results. It's difficult to directly control for income level because it's not like your driver's license has your annual salary printed on it. As far as I know, cops don't ask people how much money they make when they get pulled over. However, researchers have attempted to get around this hardship, usually by using income data from the United States Census Bureau to estimate the likely socioeconomic status of the victims of police brutality. According to a recent study using this methodology, police are much more likely to use deadly force in neighborhoods that are poorer and Blacker. It also found that in neighborhoods that are majority white, Black people are still much more likely to be killed in police interactions. Another study using data from the Census Bureau confirms this. It also showed that the rate of police killings increases as the rate of poverty increases, as we could all imagine. However, this study also found, quote, higher poverty among the Black population accounts for a meaningful but relatively modest portion of the Black-white gap in police killing rates, unquote. When controlling for poverty levels using this method, there is still a significant portion of police killings of Black people that are left unexplained. So even when we look at police brutality data through the lens of poverty, we still find evidence of racial bias. I also provided in that other video many examples of racial bias that just don't seem to be able to be explained by the poverty thesis. We know that Black people are more likely to be perceived as threatening than white people, which in and of itself is conceivably a catalyst for a future altercation. Police brutality is usually justified by the perceived threat of the victims, even in cases where video evidence seems to suggest that there wasn't much of a threat. Police are more likely to stop Black people than white people. Police are more likely to search Black people once they've been stopped, even though they've been shown to be less likely to be found with contraband. Studies show that police bias decreases when the officer cannot determine the race of the person in question, like at nighttime. Another report that I found since the making of that video came out of the Chicago Police Department. It found that police used more force against Black people than white people, even though Black people resisted less. The idea that Black people are more likely to resist is another common argument. And now we have some evidence suggesting that that may not be true. Also in Chicago, in cases where the suspect was considered to be a legitimate deadly threat to the officers, lethal force was used far more often against black suspects than white ones. And keep in mind, many of the reports like this are coming from data provided by the police department themselves. So it's possible, if not likely, that the reality is even worse than what we get to see. And there's a lot more examples, but I don't want to make the same video twice. So you can go back and watch that video and be sure to check the list of sources if you'd like to. But it just seems to me that there is way too much data that completely flies in the face of this poverty hypothesis. When talking about systemic racism, it's important to understand implicit bias. It's this idea that as flawed human beings who often have to make snap judgments about other people, none of us are immune to prejudice. And when certain stereotypes and harmful generalizations gets permeated throughout our history and our culture, it's easy for people to develop subconscious attitudes towards different groups and different people, which may not necessarily be fair, to put it mildly. This is why I think we all need to consciously and consistently examine and re-examine how we think about and talk about each other, because none of us are immune to this. But this is especially important for people whose decisions have a significant effect on other people's lives, like an employer or a teacher or a judge or a police officer. You'll notice that in these videos, I mostly use the term racial bias rather than racism. Now, this is kind of an optics thing because some white people's brains just shut off as soon as they hear the word racism. But it's also because I need people to understand that normal people who happen to work in the criminal justice system make decisions every day that provably result in disproportionate harm towards Black Americans, as well as Latin Americans and natives and disabled people and LGBTQ people. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to say that police officers are just these white supremacist maniacs that salivate at the idea of killing Black and brown people, except when they are. So yeah, in spite of the implicit biases that I just talked about, most police officers probably aren't overtly violent and racist. However, there is definitely a disproportionate amount of individual racism, white supremacy, and other bigotry that has either carried over from the civil rights era or has resurged in recent times that seems to have permeated American police departments and other law enforcement agencies. So much so that the FBI has been quietly investigating it for decades. Not that they've really done anything about it, but there has been much evidence of right-wing extremists and white supremacists infiltrating law enforcement and the military. It got so bad in the military that the Department of Defense started to enforce stricter screening and monitoring of recruits. But this sort of screening is less prevalent in local law enforcement, with many police departments feeling like they have their hands tied due to the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of expression. And even when officers do get fired for their hateful views or other misconduct, sometimes the firings get reversed by judges, or the person simply gets rehired by another department. And it is very common for police officers across the country to get caught posting racist and sexist and homophobic messages on their social media and in their personal text messages, including messages that would probably get this video age restricted, if not completely taken down, if I shared them with you. But I will share some links to articles discussing this if you're interested. The Plainview Project is an online database that has looked at the Facebook accounts of over 3,000 current and former police officers. And it found that as many as 1 in 5 of them made public posts or comments that were bigoted or violent. And the more you look into this, the more you realize that it's not just a few bad apples, as people like to say. Now, I could probably do a whole separate video about the reasons for this, but the fact remains that there is a significant and systemic issue with bigotry and hatred within America's law enforcement agencies. And when you think about how many of these people are out on the streets, patrolling our neighborhoods, it shouldn't be a surprise to you that there's a discrepancy when it comes to harassment and violence towards Black people and other minorities. And again, this is on top of the implicit bias that is present in probably all human beings. So things like sensitivity or bias training, I think that could be useful, especially in a job where other people's lives are literally in your hands. But beyond that, we have to do better at rooting out the culture of white supremacy and bigotry that has demonstrably permeated police departments across America. And this is all to say that racial bias and outright racism are the issues here. Poverty is a part of it for sure. There are lots of articles and papers and reports about just how screwed up the system is for poor people. But even if poverty wasn't a factor, it wouldn't magically make this guy not racist. And it's not going to erase the prejudices and biases that develop in a police culture that seems to turn a blind eye to the bigotry and hate that festers within it. People like that would still exist. And if you give them power or you give them guns, there will still be racially motivated harassment, discrimination, and violence. And we have the data to prove it. That's just me though. What do you think? Big shout outs to ExpressVPN for sponsoring today's video. ExpressVPN is a virtual private network that adds an extra layer of privacy between you and other parties that might want access to your data, like hackers, advertisers, your ISP, even the government. It achieves this by encrypting your data as it goes in and out of your devices, as well as by masking your IP address, allowing you to browse the internet anonymously. ExpressVPN has unbeatable security. They do not log or store your data. In fact, they don't have your data in the first place. And they've actually been audited by third parties to prove that this is true. They've got the fastest speeds and 24/7 customer support. All this is probably why ExpressVPN has been rated the #1 VPN by several publications like CNET, Wired, TechRadar, and more. It's also super easy to use. You literally just click a button. Yeah, it's on now. I use it quite simply for an added layer of privacy on the internet. The amount of online data collection in this day and age is quite frankly ridiculous. So I'm into anything that helps me control that. And ExpressVPN is an important tool in that process. So if you'd like to try it out, just go to expressvpn.com/T1J to find out how you can get 3 free months added on to your subscription. And remember, by supporting sponsors like ExpressVPN, you not only get access to a great service, but you also support me and help me take my content to the next level.